The morning opened under an unusual calm in global energy markets, yet beneath the surface, signals of disruption were already accumulating. By this point, reports from maritime monitoring indicated a sudden and unprecedented drop in Russian oil exports, an anomaly that industry analysts noted with growing concern. Official statements described minor logistical delays, yet sources familiar with the operations of key export terminals cautioned that the scale of the disruption suggested more than routine issues. In these hours, oil flows from major ports were observed to be markedly reduced, and preliminary shipping manifests indicated diversions that did not align with scheduled deliveries. Between the lines, insiders were already questioning whether these were isolated incidents or a sign of systemic pressure. By mid-morning, the extent of the disruption became increasingly visible. Several oil tankers, expected to depart from the northern ports, were held back under circumstances described officially as security inspections. Analysts in the field noted, however, that such measures were irregular and lacked precedent of this magnitude. In the corridors of industry forums, speculation began to circulate. Could this be linked to recent drone strikes targeting infrastructure critical to the extraction and transport of crude? Sources with knowledge of supply chain logistics indicated that even minimal damage to key terminals could trigger cascading delays throughout the export network. Yet, publicly, the narrative remained tightly controlled, portraying the situation as manageable. In parallel, financial observers reported subtle movements in energy-linked assets. Futures contracts for crude exhibited volatility that was unusual for this time of day, suggesting that market participants were responding to more than the officially reported minor disruptions. Some funds appeared to adjust positions quietly, a fact that was noted by energy market strategists as indicative of underlying concern. The contrast was striking. While official channels emphasized stability, real-time indicators hinted at growing instability beneath the surface. Experts in energy geopolitics were already flagging the potential for a longer-term impact, though details remained opaque. The very pattern of information dissemination hinted at a story unfolding beyond what was being acknowledged publicly. By midday, the disruption could no longer be dismissed as localized. Ports in multiple regions showed staggered operations, with tankers queuing unusually long before departure. Industry insiders described the phenomenon as a partial freeze of export flows, a term that, while not officially recognized, circulated widely among analysts. At the same time, satellite imagery and commercial tracking data suggested irregular movements of key infrastructure assets, reinforcing suspicions that drone strikes had targeted critical nodes in the supply chain. In expert circles, debates intensified over whether these events were opportunistic attacks or part of a broader, coordinated strategy to exert pressure on Russian oil logistics. However, public communications maintained an aura of calm, emphasizing routine procedures and maintenance. Across the sector, whispers of internal assessments circulated in private channels. Several major oil companies reportedly convened emergency meetings to evaluate the operational impact of the attacks, though no formal announcements were made. Analysts in the energy community noted that the speed and scope of responses pointed to a scenario far more serious than publicly described. In addition, financial institutions involved in commodity financing began reviewing exposure, prompting subtle but noticeable ripples in related markets. Observers interpreted these signals as early markers of systemic stress, with implications extending beyond the immediate logistics chain. Yet, the official tone remained measured, masking a developing crisis that was already reshaping expectations about Russian oil exports. Despite the outward calm, the underlying picture suggested tension. Shipping routes were being altered, production schedules adjusted, and contingency plans rapidly evaluated. In the eyes of industry insiders, the day was evolving into a test of resilience for the entire export network. Even as analysts parsed data, the full extent of the operational and strategic consequences remained uncertain. Yet, for those following developments closely, the writing on the wall was unmistakable. The disruption was not merely temporary, and the ramifications could extend into global energy flows. Possibly, it is worth following the unfolding developments. Some sources suggest this is only the beginning. But further developments would reveal that the situation was far more complex than it appeared at first glance. By midday, the analytical focus shifted from immediate disruption to the detailed mechanisms underlying the sudden drop in Russian oil exports. Shipping logs and port activity reports, cross-referenced with industry tracking data, began to reveal patterns that did not match the official explanations of routine inspections. According to sources within the shipping industry, tankers delayed or rerouted in the northern ports were carrying volumes that, if delivered, would account for a significant portion of Russia's daily export quota. In these hours, experts highlighted that even a minor reduction in throughput at a handful of critical terminals could amplify into a measurable shortfall in global crude availability. The complexity of the logistics network meant that localized interruptions produced cascading effects, affecting both scheduled deliveries and strategic stockpile management. Between the lines, analysts noticed a discrepancy between the reported operational capacity of several terminals and the actual output observed through real-time monitoring systems. Official statements indicated that all facilities were functioning within expected parameters, yet commercial tracking revealed a slowdown in loading operations, some by as much as a third of normal throughput. In expert discussions, it was suggested that the discrepancy could be partly explained by heightened security measures following recent drone attacks, but also possibly by preemptive adjustments aimed at mitigating further disruptions. Insiders in the energy sector noted that the speed of response suggested a level of coordination that went beyond ad hoc crisis management. Simultaneously, the financial markets reacted to the emerging anomalies with subtle but telling movements. Oil-linked derivatives and futures showed early signs of volatility, and arbitrage desks reported unusual trading patterns. In the energy community, these signals were interpreted not merely as a reaction to minor operational delays, but as evidence that traders were pricing in uncertainty regarding the reliability of Russian export flows. According to industry contacts, the interplay between physical logistics and market behavior created a feedback loop. Even limited operational disruptions were now triggering broader financial recalibrations. Officially, however, market authorities maintained that all indicators remained within normal fluctuations. The operational ripple effects extended further, touching refineries dependent on Russian crude. Several European and Asian processing facilities began issuing statements citing supply adjustments, framed as routine maintenance or inventory balancing. Behind the scenes, however, analysts pointed out that these adjustments were direct responses to the altered delivery schedules. In expert circles, debates emerged over whether the disruptions would result in temporary regional shortages or if they signaled a deeper vulnerability within the global oil supply chain. Observers noted that the speed with which companies adapted operational plans underscored the fragility of the system, yet the public narrative emphasized continuity and stability. By this stage of the day, internal communications among energy executives revealed concern over potential compounding effects. Some firms reportedly assessed the need to reallocate shipments or to negotiate contingency contracts with alternative suppliers. Meanwhile, satellite imagery and vessel tracking data began to suggest that infrastructure repairs and damage assessments were ongoing, although precise details remained confidential. Analysts noted that even partial impairment of export terminals could significantly impact the timing and volume of oil reaching international markets. In effect, the day was shaping into a case study of logistical sensitivity. Minor disruptions in critical nodes had the potential to propagate across an interconnected system, generating uncertainty far beyond the immediate region. At the same time, observers began to consider geopolitical implications. In expert assessments, the timing and targets of the drone strikes hinted at more than random acts of sabotage. Some interpreted them as a strategic move to influence energy flows and exert pressure on global markets. Between official statements of operational normality and the evidence gathered from monitoring systems, a pattern of calculated disruption started to emerge. Analysts in trading hubs speculated that these events could be indicative of longer-term tactical maneuvers, suggesting a deliberate reshaping of export reliability. In these hours, the contrast between public messaging and the operational reality became increasingly pronounced, revealing a complex interplay of logistics, strategy, and market psychology. However, as the day progressed, all these insights hinted at an underlying reality. The official narrative covered only the surface, while the deeper dynamics were already evolving beyond immediate observation. As the day unfolded further, the first signs of a hidden dimension to the crisis became unmistakable. What initially appeared as logistical disruption now revealed patterns pointing to strategic calculations with broader implications. Sources close to key export terminals indicated that the drone strikes had specifically targeted nodes with no redundancy, creating bottlenecks in pipelines and storage facilities whose repair would require coordinated engineering efforts. According to insiders, the immediate consequence was not merely a slowdown in exports, but the exposure of systemic vulnerabilities previously unnoticed outside specialized circles. In expert discussions, it was noted that such vulnerabilities could be exploited not only to hinder Russian output but to influence international oil pricing dynamics. Simultaneously, market actors adjusted their positions in ways that suggested awareness of these deeper dynamics. Commodity trading desks, acting on fragmented intelligence, began reassigning risk portfolios, reallocating assets from Russian-linked contracts toward alternative crude sources. Analysts observing these maneuvers highlighted that the reactions were faster and more synchronized than would be expected from publicly available information. The contrast between what was being reported officially and the subtle shifts in market behavior hinted at the existence of a parallel understanding, a tacit acknowledgement among insiders that the oil export network was under more serious strain than publicly admitted. The dissonance reinforced the sense that the observable reality and the operational truth were diverging. At the same time, intelligence shared in energy advisory circles suggested that the attacks were timed to maximize strategic effect. According to some assessments, the disruption coincided with peak export periods and key contractual obligations, intensifying the pressure on supply chains and creating leverage over international buyers dependent on Russian crude. Sources explained that these disruptions, while technical in origin, carried implications for diplomatic and financial negotiations. Analysts noted that this form of engineered instability, though subtle, could influence broader policy decisions in importing countries, potentially triggering adjustments in energy security strategies and reserve management. Internally, Russian operators reportedly faced difficult choices. According to sources familiar with decision-making processes, executives were weighing options between accelerating repairs at targeted facilities and redistributing exports through secondary routes, each carrying operational and political risk. The presence of multiple, partially functional nodes required careful prioritization to prevent further cascading delays. In the meantime, official statements continued to project confidence and routine management of the situation, while industry insiders quietly observed that the reality was far more complex. The juxtaposition of public calm and private urgency created a tension that analysts described as latent operational stress, one that could have ramifications for both domestic production and international supply agreements. By midday, the sense of observing an unfolding strategic narrative became more pronounced. Analysts noted unusual coordination between operators and financial institutions, suggesting that contingency planning was already factoring in extended disruptions. Simultaneously, satellite monitoring confirmed that certain transport routes remained congested or inactive, adding credibility to the notion that the drone strikes were carefully calibrated to produce maximum logistical pressure. In expert assessments, the impact was understood as both immediate, manifested in delayed shipments, and anticipatory, shaping market behavior in ways designed to influence perception and strategy simultaneously. The day's events were no longer merely a disruption, they were a demonstration of the intricate relationship between infrastructure vulnerability, market psychology, and geopolitical leverage. Amid these developments, a subtle but persistent call to maintain attention emerged across analytical circles. The unfolding situation, while superficially controlled, was signaling the potential for a series of strategic shifts in global energy flows. Observers suggested that the deeper story might only be fully revealed over time, contingent on the responses of operators, regulators, and market actors. In this context, it became clear that following the developments closely was essential, as the visible surface masked a network of tactical considerations and latent consequences. Possibly, tracking the day's evolution would reveal insights unavailable to those relying solely on official communication. However, the underlying complexity hinted that even these insights were only partial. Beneath the operational adjustments and market reactions, forces were aligning in ways that could alter the energy landscape more fundamentally than the immediate disruption suggested. As the day advanced toward mid-afternoon, the situation escalated beyond operational disruptions into a broader display of systemic pressure. Observers tracking port activity and pipeline logistics noted an unusual accumulation of idle tankers in multiple northern terminals, a phenomenon that sources described as unprecedented. The delays were no longer isolated, they now reflected a network-wide strain affecting the flow of crude to major international markets. In energy circles, analysts highlighted that such synchronized bottlenecks could only occur when multiple critical nodes were simultaneously compromised, either through deliberate action or cascading failures amplified by the earlier drone strikes. Yet, official statements continued to depict the situation as manageable, emphasizing routine security checks and minor technical maintenance. In parallel, financial implications began to manifest more clearly. Futures and options tied to Russian crude exhibited sharper fluctuations, with volumes suggesting strategic repositioning by large institutional players. Analysts in commodity markets interpreted these movements as evidence that investors were factoring in potential extended constraints on supply. While publicly reported trading remained within conventional ranges, the underlying flows indicated anticipatory behavior, hedge funds and energy traders adjusting positions based on operational intelligence not yet available to general media. In expert assessments, the coordination of these moves underscored the hidden depth of the crisis, signaling that the market was reacting to latent vulnerabilities rather than the official narrative. Meanwhile, internal communications within Russian energy companies reportedly focused on crisis mitigation. According to sources, executives were evaluating temporary shutdowns and rerouting strategies, each carrying the risk of compounding delays elsewhere. Technical teams worked to restore functionality at affected terminals, while simultaneously assessing the resilience of secondary supply routes. Analysts familiar with the infrastructure warned that even minor errors in these decisions could amplify disruptions and trigger knock-on effects in global oil availability. Yet, public communications remained tightly controlled, projecting an image of stability and operational normality, a contrast that industry observers found increasingly striking. Between the official calm and the operational urgency, the real-time landscape of the sector was shifting rapidly. Geopolitical implications also intensified. Sources in expert circles noted that the drone strikes, coupled with the logistical responses, appeared to be strategically timed to influence not only market perceptions but also broader international leverage. Nations heavily dependent on Russian crude faced immediate operational questions, including rescheduling shipments and adjusting reserve strategies. Meanwhile, energy policy advisors began recalibrating risk assessments, considering the potential for extended disruptions and their impact on both regional pricing and diplomatic negotiations. Analysts observed that even small changes in Russian export volumes could ripple across markets and political discussions, amplifying the significance of the day's events far beyond the physical logistics. By these hours, the situation had assumed a complexity that exceeded initial expectations. Observers tracked the interplay between operational constraints, market behavior, and strategic signaling, noting a convergence that suggested deliberate orchestration rather than coincidental disruption. Industry insiders reported that contingency measures were being tested under pressure, exposing latent weaknesses that might have remained unnoticed under normal circumstances. The pattern emerging was one of controlled uncertainty. The official narrative suggested calm, but the orchestration of supply, logistics, and market influence implied a scenario being actively shaped behind the scenes. Possibly, following the evolving sequence of events would reveal how intertwined infrastructure, strategy, and market psychology had become. However, at this stage, it was clear to experts that the visible crisis was only part of a larger, more intricate system of pressures and influences. Beneath the surface, the alignment of operational, financial, and geopolitical forces indicated a level of complexity that would continue to unfold, with consequences extending well beyond the immediate disruption of Russian oil exports. As the day approached its peak, a gradual sense of perspective began to emerge, yet the underlying turbulence remained unmistakable. Observers noted that while some export terminals had resumed partial operations and certain shipping delays were beginning to ease, the cumulative effect of the day's disruptions had already reverberated across global energy networks. Analysts highlighted that even temporary reductions in Russian crude flows had triggered adjustments in reserve utilization, spot market activity, and derivative hedging strategies, a ripple effect that would extend into subsequent days. The juxtaposition of resumed activity and lingering uncertainty created a quiet tension, a reminder that the surface calm was fragile and provisional. Meanwhile, internal assessments within energy companies and advisory bodies continued to circulate privately, underscoring the operational challenges that persisted despite outward appearances. Sources familiar with these discussions indicated that contingency planning had entered a new phase, emphasizing not just restoration of disrupted flows but the anticipation of further shocks. Analysts in energy and finance circles noted that the day had exposed structural vulnerabilities, nodes within the export network whose failure, even partial, could propagate systemic consequences. In these hours, it became apparent that the day's events were not an isolated incident, but a revealing probe into the resilience of Russian energy logistics and its integration with global markets. Financial observers noted that while market volatility appeared to stabilize, underlying positions reflected a cautious recalibration. Futures and derivatives had adjusted to the reality of constrained flows, yet the spectrum of strategic responses suggested that institutional actors were positioning for contingencies that remained invisible to the broader public. Between the apparent stabilization and the private maneuvering, a dual narrative emerged, one of official continuity and another of discrete adaptation. Analysts emphasized that the visible signals, while informative, represented only a fraction of the operational and strategic complexities exposed over the course of the day. Geopolitical implications, too, remained in focus. The drone strikes had not only disrupted infrastructure but also sent signals affecting energy diplomacy, international negotiations, and supply dependencies. Expert circles discussed the potential for shifts in alliances and procurement strategies, noting that nations reliant on Russian crude were already weighing alternative options and reserve strategies. The interplay between tactical disruption, market perception, and diplomatic calculation created a multidimensional environment where the full consequences could only be anticipated gradually. In this context, observers noted that the day's events had illuminated the delicate balance between operational resilience and strategic leverage in the global energy system. By midday, the narrative coalesced into a somber clarity. The immediate disruption had been partially mitigated, but the latent vulnerabilities and systemic pressures remained visible to those closely monitoring the situation. Analysts concluded that the day had revealed the fragility of interconnected networks, the sensitivity of markets to even temporary operational shocks, and the complex interweaving of infrastructure, strategy, and geopolitical influence. Official statements continued to emphasize stability, yet for those observing the flows, communications, and strategic adjustments, the day stood as a clear reminder: the story of Russian oil exports was not concluded. On the surface, operations appeared to resume. Beneath, a new phase of strategic tension had quietly begun. At first glance, the landscape seemed to have regained equilibrium. Yet attentive observers recognized that this was merely a pause within a larger, ongoing sequence. The day had demonstrated that disruptions, while measurable, could ripple far beyond their immediate context, and that even restored flows did not erase the deeper pressures now shaping decisions across the energy sector. For those following these developments closely, the implication was unmistakable: the unfolding events were not an endpoint, but the threshold of a continuing, intricate narrative, where every subsequent decision would be informed by the unseen currents already set in motion.